Hello, historians. It's Mrs. Weber here. I'm sitting outside in the cold to bring you, that's right, lesson number 3 on the Cold War. So today's topic is the American involvement in Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. So if you recall from lesson number 2, my last YouTube video, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan worked together and combined to create a pattern for U.S. foreign policy throughout the Cold War. So to summarize both of those ideas into one phrase, it was really about containing communism. So for our purposes today, we're going to be pointing a spotlight on 3 key locations where the U.S. policy of containment was most famously or infamously applied. We're going to go to Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. So this video is going to give you a glimpse of all 3 locations. This is not meant to be a deep dive into the Korean War, Vietnam War, the Bay of Pigs, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we are keeping this as an overview, and we're going to try to do it briefly today so that you can really see how American foreign policy was expressed throughout the Cold War. However, if you're interested in any of these topics and you want to explore them more thoroughly, I highly recommend that you check it out using other people's channels on YouTube. There's so much content out there, and if you want some recommendations, just reach out to me. I can give you some suggestions if you want like a deep dive on those topics. So before we get started with our 3 spotlight locations today, we need to define a really important term, which is domino theory. That's this theory that if one country in a region became communist, then the surrounding countries would follow, like a domino. This term was coined by President Dwight D. Eisenhower when he suggested that if French Indochina fell to communists, there would be a domino effect throughout Southeast Asia. So you can see in President Eisenhower's response, he was very much influenced by this idea that comes from the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan that the U.S. should contain the spread of communism at all costs. Not only does this thinking lead to the U.S. involvement in the Korean War and Vietnam War, it also results in something called McCarthyism domestically. If you're unfamiliar with McCarthyism or the Red Scare, this was a campaign led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, hence the name, in the early 1950s. It was to root out any communist influence in the U.S. government, but it also spread to places like Hollywood and other institutions. And if you were accused of being a communist, whether it was an unfair allegation or even a false allegation, you could be blacklisted from your job, even if you didn't belong to the Communist Party. And you'll see some popular culture references to McCarthyism, 2 movies that have been made recently about McCarthyism. Is Hail Caesar and Good Night and Good Luck. So if you are stuck at home and you need something to watch, you could check out any of those movies. So the containment of communism was priority number 1, not just abroad, but also at home within our own borders in the U.S. in the 1950s. So with that as our backdrop, let's travel to our first destination. Let's go to Korea. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when some 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel. This is the boundary that was between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea in the south. This invasion was what we consider to be the first military action of the Cold War. By July, American troops had entered the war on South Korea's side. As far as American officials were concerned, it was a war against the forces of international communism itself. When the Korean War ended in July 1953, 5 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives. And what's sad about that, in addition to that being a high casualty rate, it's also a war that we call the Forgotten War in the U.S. because there's such a huge lack of attention that it's received, not just at the time, but since, compared to other more well-known conflicts like obviously World War I, World War II, Vietnam War. The Korean Peninsula, notably, is still divided to this day. So our big question is, why did the U.S. become involved in the Korean conflict? So the decision to intervene in Korea grew out of the tense atmosphere that was what the Cold War was characterized by. On the eve of the North Korean invasion, a number of events were making President Truman especially nervous. The Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb in 1949, so that means the U.S. is not the only country that has a nuclear weapon. And in Europe, the Soviet intervention in that war between Greece and Turkey gave rise to the U.S. foreign policy of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Events in Asia also contributed to an increased sense of insecurity just globally. In 1949, China is going to undergo a revolution that brings in communism, and we're going to talk about that in a future lesson. While China becomes communist, back in the US, many people were criticizing President Truman at the time for having, quote, lost China to communism. They criticized him for not providing enough aid to the Chinese nationalists and helping them stop the communist revolution. So when the North Korean troops invaded the South, Truman and his administration realized, okay, this is our chance to prove that we are going to stand up against communism. We are going to make sure it stops and is contained. So they didn't want to lose another country to communism. So the Truman administration ended up defending a nation so far away from U.S. soil. This is not just foreign policy, it's also that internal pressure. So keep in mind the era of McCarthyism back home domestically. So this is the domino theory abroad and even at home. President Harry Truman said this, and this is a direct quote: "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another," end quote. The fight on the Korean Peninsula was a symbol of the global struggle between East and West, good and evil in the Cold War. As the North Korean army pushed into Seoul, the South Korean capital, the United States readied its troops for a war against communism itself. So I gave you some pop references for McCarthyism earlier, so here's your bingeable recommendation for the Korean War: MASH. Now let's travel about 2,000 miles southwest from Korea and arrive at our second Cold War destination, Vietnam. Good morning, Vietnam! The Vietnam War was a long, costly, and divisive conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its number one ally, the United States. The conflict was intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. More than 3 million people, that's 58,000 Americans, were killed in the Vietnam War, and more than half of the dead were Vietnamese civilians. Opposition to the war in the United States bitterly divided the U.S., as for the first time, citizens watched recorded footage of the warfare on their home TVs. The Vietnam War is considered a failure of U.S. foreign policy, and we remember this conflict today for its use of chemical warfare. Maybe you've heard of Agent Orange, landmines, both of which are still wreaking havoc in Vietnam to this day. And then in addition to suffering from PTSD, many soldiers who returned home from Vietnam were not welcomed. They returned home in the midst of anti-war protests sometimes. So consider that the average age of a soldier in the Vietnam War was 21. So not much older than you. So the question we must ask is why? Why did the United States get involved in Vietnam during the Cold War? If you answered, to contain the spread of communism, you're right. So let's examine how the domino theory played out in Vietnam. In 1961, working under this domino theory, President JFK increased U.S. aid. By 1962, the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam had reached 9,000 troops, compared with fewer than 800 troops during the 1950s. So you can see it's just going to grow and grow over time. The domino theory and containment of communism continued to be a U.S. foreign policy priority, so much so that not one, not two, but 5 U.S. presidents served our country as head of state, as our president throughout the Vietnam War. So it's Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, and Nixon. So now from Asia to the Americas. So bienvenidos a Cuba. That's right. Our third and final stop on this journey through U.S. Cold War foreign policy brings us to Cuba. A mere 110 miles off the coast of Florida lies the island nation of Cuba. Keep this proximity in mind while I walk you through 2 major events on this island. So we're going to start our story in Cuba in early 1961 when President John F. Kennedy concluded that Fidel Castro was a Soviet client working to subvert Latin America. Kennedy authorized a secret invasion of Cuba by a group of Cuban exiles. The brigade hit the beach at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. But the operation collapsed. It was a massive failure, and it failed in only 2 days. Kennedy took public responsibility for the mistakes made, but remained determined to continue to try to rid Cuba of Castro. Remember, containing the spread of communism was deeply important for the United States. In November of 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly delivered medium-range nuclear missiles to Cuba. U.S. intelligence picked up evidence of this, so on September 4th, 1962, Kennedy issued a public warning against the initiation of offensive weapons into Cuba. A U-2 flight on October 14th provided the first proof of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. That moment presented our country with the most dangerous U.S.-Soviet confrontation of the entire Cold War. Some advisors for JFK argued for an airstrike. Others said, let's just warn Cuba and the Soviet Union. And so our president actually took a middle ground, and he ordered Khrushchev through a letter to take down the missiles, which starts a correspondence between these two leaders. There's some back and forth, but eventually the Soviet Union did, in fact, agree to remove the medium-range bombers from Cuba, and then the United States was supposed to take out their own nuclear bombs out of Turkey in exchange. So exactly how close the United States and the Soviet Union came to nuclear war in this moment, in this issue in Cuba, remains one of the most keenly discussed issues of the entire Cold War. It could have gone a different direction, and it's one of those moments in history where you can still kind of feel that the whole world was holding its breath. So together, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan took us to 3 different locations where the U.S. attempted to contain communism: in Korea, in Vietnam, and in Cuba. So a question that you might be asking yourself at this point is, was this the best way forward? Was containment the right approach to foreign policy for the United States after World War II? The answer to that question depends on how much you know about communism and what life was really like behind the Iron Curtain. So in our next lesson, we will be examining nuclear proliferation during the Cold War. We're also going to take a close look at the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In other words, how China came to adopt communism. But for today, that's it for now. As always, check Veracross to stay up to speed on all of your assignments, and reach out to me if you have any thoughts or any questions. I absolutely love hearing from you guys. But for now, good night and good luck.